Before we begin, let me ask you something that may feel uncomfortably familiar. Have you ever walked away from a conversation feeling drained, confused, or oddly guilty without being able to explain why? Nothing dramatic was said, no obvious insult. And yet, something inside you felt smaller, heavier, disturbed. That reaction is not accidental and it is not weakness. It is psychology at work. Here is what most people never realize: toxic individuals rarely overpower you through words. They influence you through emotional access. The moment your nervous system reacts, the moment you feel the urge to defend, explain, or prove yourself, the psychological door is already open. And once that door is open, even the most subtle manipulation can walk right in. What makes this even more dangerous is that many toxic people do not look toxic at all. They can be charming, familiar, even emotionally intelligent on the surface. In fact, the most psychologically disruptive individuals are often the ones who understand emotions well enough to use them, consciously or unconsciously, as leverage. But here is the uncomfortable truth that changes everything: you do not need to confront them, expose them, or cut everyone out of your life to protect your peace. In fact, the more you fight, explain, or react, the more control you hand over. Real immunity does not come from strength in words. It comes from silence in the right places, clarity in perception, and emotional regulation so precise that their behavior simply fails to land. In the next few minutes, you are going to learn how psychology, not aggression, not avoidance, allows you to become unreachable to toxic people. Not invisible, not cold, but untouchable in the one place that matters most: your inner stability. And once you understand this, you will never experience the same conversation the same way again. Toxic behavior feels deeply personal because the human brain is wired to interpret social interactions as reflections of our worth, safety, and belonging. When someone criticizes, manipulates, dismisses, or emotionally provokes us, the nervous system reacts as if there is a direct threat. But from a psychological perspective, most toxic behavior is not a targeted attack. It is a repeated pattern rooted in the other person's internal world. Understanding this distinction is essential for emotional immunity. Toxic individuals often operate from unresolved insecurity, chronic emotional dysregulation, or deeply ingrained defense mechanisms developed earlier in life. These patterns form long before you enter their lives. They may include projection, where internal discomfort is redirected outward; control-seeking, where dominance temporarily soothes anxiety; or emotional volatility, where intensity substitutes for genuine regulation. When these behaviors appear, they are expressions of psychological coping, not accurate evaluations of you. The problem arises when the recipient unconsciously accepts the behavior as meaningful information rather than emotional discharge. The brain has a natural tendency to personalize negative social input. This is known as egocentric bias, the assumption that others' actions are caused by us. In toxic dynamics, this bias becomes especially damaging. You begin analyzing your tone, your words, your intentions, searching for what you did wrong. But psychologically speaking, if the same person creates tension, guilt, or confusion across multiple relationships, the behavior is not situational, it is patterned. Patterns do not require your participation to exist. They simply repeat wherever conditions allow. Once toxic behavior is recognized as patterned rather than personal, emotional intensity decreases. The mind shifts from, "What is wrong with me?" to, "What is happening within them?" This does not excuse harmful behavior, nor does it invite tolerance. Instead, it creates psychological distance. Distance allows clarity, and clarity restores agency. You stop reacting from wounded self-doubt and begin responding from informed awareness. This reframing also disrupts the reinforcement cycle. Toxic behavior often relies on emotional feedback, defensiveness, over-explaining, guilt, or visible distress. When behavior is interpreted as a pattern instead of a message, the urge to respond emotionally weakens. The nervous system remains regulated because it no longer perceives the interaction as a threat to identity. True psychological strength begins when you stop treating dysfunction as information about your value. When behavior is seen accurately, as a reflection of the other person's internal state, it loses the power to destabilize you, and what no longer destabilizes you can no longer control you. Emotional detachment is often misunderstood as emotional coldness, avoidance, or indifference, but psychologically, it is none of these things. True detachment is the ability to remain internally regulated while staying fully present. It is not the absence of feeling, it is the absence of emotional hijacking. When people suppress emotions, they push feelings downward where they resurface later as anxiety, irritability, or emotional numbness. Detachment, in contrast, allows emotions to exist without granting them control over behavior or decision-making. The nervous system plays a central role in this process. Toxic interactions tend to activate the threat response, triggering fight, flight, or freeze reactions. When someone provokes guilt, anger, or self-doubt, the body often reacts before the mind can evaluate the situation. Emotional detachment begins with awareness of this physiological activation. Instead of immediately responding, you create a pause. That pause is not passive, it is psychologically protective. In that space, the brain regains access to higher reasoning, allowing you to choose a response rather than react impulsively. Detachment also requires the ability to observe emotions rather than merge with them. Feelings such as anger or hurt are internal signals, not commands. When you identify with them completely, they dictate your actions. When you observe them, they inform you without overwhelming you. This distinction is critical when dealing with toxic individuals, who often rely on emotional reactivity to maintain influence. By staying emotionally present but behaviorally neutral, you break the cycle of escalation. Importantly, detachment does not mean denying boundaries or tolerating mistreatment. It means enforcing boundaries without emotional chaos. A calm refusal, a brief response, or silence delivered without visible agitation communicates far more strength than emotional confrontation. This regulated presence deprives toxic behavior of reinforcement as there is no emotional payoff. Over time, emotional detachment retrains the nervous system. Interactions that once felt overwhelming begin to feel manageable. The mind learns that not every emotional stimulus requires engagement. This internal shift restores psychological energy and self-respect. You are no longer drained by other people's dysregulation because you are no longer absorbing it. Ultimately, emotional detachment without suppression is a form of self-trust. It is the confidence that you can feel deeply without losing stability. When you master this skill, emotional manipulation loses its leverage and your inner state becomes something others cannot easily disturb. Cognitive boundary setting is the internal process of deciding what information is allowed to shape your self, perception, and emotional state. Unlike external boundaries, which involve what you say or do, cognitive boundaries determine what you believe, absorb, and carry forward. This is especially critical when dealing with toxic individuals, because their influence rarely comes from authority or truth. It comes from repetition, emotional intensity, and strategic doubt. When the mind lacks clear cognitive boundaries, it treats every strong statement as meaningful, even when it is distorted or false. The human brain is highly susceptible to internalization, particularly under emotional pressure. When someone speaks with confidence, criticism, or urgency, the mind often assumes there must be validity behind it. Toxic behavior exploits this tendency. Dismissive comments, subtle insults, guilt-inducing statements, or exaggerated blame are designed to bypass rational evaluation and land directly in the emotional center. Without cognitive boundaries, these messages are absorbed as self-relevant data rather than external noise. Reframing what you internalize begins with conscious evaluation. Instead of asking, "How do I respond to this?" the psychologically protective question becomes, "Is this information accurate, or is it emotional discharge?" This single shift interrupts automatic absorption. It reminds the brain that not all input is equal. Just because something is said does not mean it is true, useful, or worthy of storage. Many toxic remarks are reflections of the speaker's internal conflict rather than objective observations. Cognitive boundaries also require separating behavior from identity. When criticism is internalized without filtration, it becomes a statement about who you are rather than what occurred. This erodes self-esteem and increases emotional dependence. By mentally labeling comments as subjective experiences instead of facts, you prevent them from embedding into your self-concept. You can acknowledge that someone feels dissatisfied without adopting their dissatisfaction as your own truth. This mental filtering protects psychological energy. Constantly processing, analyzing, and emotionally reacting to distorted input exhausts the mind. When cognitive boundaries are strong, the brain conserves energy by discarding irrelevant data. Over time, this practice reshapes neural pathways. The mind becomes less reactive and more discerning, automatically pausing before internalizing external judgments. Ultimately, cognitive boundary setting restores psychological authority. You become the gatekeeper of your inner world rather than a passive receiver of others' emotions. When people realize their words no longer penetrate or destabilize you, their influence diminishes. What you refuse to internalize cannot control you, and what cannot control you eventually loses its power. Predictability and non-reactivity are often mistaken for passivity, but in psychological terms, they are forms of behavioral control. Toxic dynamics thrive on emotional variability. When a person reacts with anger one day, over-explains the next, and withdraws the day after, the inconsistency creates an opening for manipulation. Unpredictable emotional responses keep the nervous system engaged and the power dynamic unstable. Predictability, on the other hand, introduces psychological friction that toxic behavior struggles to move through. From a behavioral psychology perspective, every repeated behavior is sustained by reinforcement. Emotional reactions, defensiveness, visible frustration, justification, or guilt serve as reinforcement signals. They tell the other person that their behavior has impact. Even negative attention can be rewarding because it confirms influence. When responses become consistently calm, brief, and emotionally neutral, reinforcement disappears. Without reinforcement, behavior naturally weakens. This is not theory, it is how the brain learns. Non-reactivity does not mean silence in all situations. It means intentional response rather than emotional reflex. A predictable pattern might involve short acknowledgments, neutral tone, or delayed responses. The key is consistency. When the same emotional output appears regardless of provocation, the other person loses the ability to control the interaction. Their attempts to escalate fail because the emotional outcome never changes. Predictability also stabilizes your own nervous system. When you know how you will respond before the interaction occurs, the brain feels safer. This sense of internal certainty reduces anxiety and prevents emotional hijacking. Over time, the body learns that it does not need to brace for impact. The interaction becomes less threatening, not because the other person changed, but because your response is no longer negotiable. Non-reactivity also exposes intent. When emotional responses are removed, manipulative strategies become more obvious. Guilt trips lose effectiveness. Provocations feel hollow. The interaction becomes transparent. This clarity further weakens the emotional hold because confusion is replaced with understanding. In many cases, toxic individuals either reduce the behavior or seek stimulation elsewhere once predictability is established. Not because they are confronted, but because the dynamic no longer serves its psychological function. What remains is your sense of control. By mastering predictability and non-reactivity, you stop participating in emotional games you never agreed to play. And when you no longer play, you cannot be psychologically defeated. Psychological self-authority is the internal position from which you evaluate yourself, your decisions, and your worth without outsourcing that responsibility to others. When this authority is weak, validation becomes a psychological dependency. Approval, reassurance, and acceptance from others act as emotional regulators, determining how safe or valuable you feel. Toxic individuals instinctively sense this vulnerability. Whether intentionally or not, they exploit it by offering conditional approval, withdrawing affirmation, or creating doubt that keeps you emotionally reliant. The need for validation often develops early, shaped by environments where emotional safety depended on performance, compliance, or pleasing others. Over time, the mind learns that external feedback is necessary for internal stability. As an adult, this creates a hidden power imbalance. Anyone who can influence your self-perception can influence your behavior. Psychological self-authority reverses this dynamic by returning the role of evaluator back to you. Ending the need for validation does not mean rejecting feedback or becoming isolated. It means discerning whose input is informative versus whose input is destabilizing. When self-authority is intact, feedback is processed as data, not as a verdict on identity. Praise does not inflate, and criticism does not collapse. Emotional equilibrium becomes internally regulated rather than externally negotiated. Toxic behavior loses power when validation is no longer sought. Guilt tactics fail because they rely on your desire to be seen as good. Manipulation weakens because it depends on your fear of disapproval. When approval is no longer the currency you operate with, control strategies become ineffective. You stop explaining yourself excessively. You stop proving your intentions. Silence and calm confidence replace justification. Psychological self-authority also reshapes boundaries. Decisions are made based on internal values rather than external pressure. This creates consistency, which further stabilizes the nervous system. The mind no longer scans for emotional cues from others to determine how to feel. Instead, it relies on self-trust. This trust grows with practice. Each time you honor your perception over external noise, the internal authority strengthens. Ultimately, self-authority is the foundation of emotional immunity. When your worth is self-defined, no one can destabilize you by withholding validation or offering conditional acceptance. Influence requires access. Self-authority closes that access point. What remains is a grounded, quiet confidence that does not need to be defended. And what does not need to be defended cannot be taken away. In the end, becoming immune to toxic people is not about changing who you are. It is about reclaiming who you already were before doubt, guilt, and emotional noise took over. Toxic behavior only survives where there is access. Access to your emotions, your self-worth, and your attention. When that access is removed, the behavior collapses on its own. Psychological immunity is quiet. It does not argue, prove, or seek understanding from those who are committed to misunderstanding. It stands firm through clarity, regulation, and self-respect. You stop reacting not because you are afraid, but because you are no longer available for manipulation. You stop explaining not because you are weak, but because your truth no longer requires approval. When you understand behavior as pattern, regulate emotion without suppressing it, filter what you internalize, remain predictable and non-reactive, and stand in self-authority, something profound happens. Toxic people lose relevance. Their words no longer echo. Their presence no longer disturbs. Their attempts to provoke simply fall flat. This is not emotional distance, it is emotional mastery, and mastery does not announce itself. It shows in your calm, your boundaries, and your refusal to give your inner peace to anyone who has not earned the right to it. Remember this: not every battle is meant to be fought, and not every voice deserves a response. The strongest position is not control over others, but control over yourself. When you reach that place, toxicity has nowhere left to live.